Hey there folks, Rel here. Today we're going to be comparing the Flare and the Ursa, which are light machine guns for the Vanu Sovereign Heavy Assault. They're slow firing and hard hitting weapons that are extremely similar. So similar that I'm not really sure why they're both in the game, but to explore that thought, we'll do a nice comparison and see which is better for your personal playstyle, given the small differences inherent in both the weapons. I do want to preface this by just giving you a too long didn't watch at the beginning and just say that both of the weapons are good, and regardless of what you purchase, they're both going to give you close to the same functionality at basically the same range. So if you don't want to sit through the whole video, that's the long and short of it. But if you do want to stick around, let's break some things down in detail. The Flare is going to cost 250 certs or 500 station cash to unlock, whereas the Ursa costs 1000 certs or 700 station cash to unlock. So the differences there are pretty stark. And really the reason for that seems to be that from an aesthetic standpoint, the Flare does not look amazing. It could be mistaken for practically any LMG in the VS arsenal. The Ursa, on the other hand, has a gorgeous model, which is no doubt the driving force to even purchase the thing in the first place. I really wish that the Flare would at least get the illuminated light rails on them, but what can you do? To break down the similarities, they both have a 75 round magazine and 225 in reserve. Both deal 167 damage up to 10 meters and 143 damage at 65 meters. Both have a standard 50% movement speed reduction while aiming down sights, and both can use optics up to 6 times zoom, including the night vision and 2x scopes. Both have the same cone of fire and bloom values, which I'd categorize as far as sustained fire goes, poor to moderate hip fire, and high aim down sights accuracy. But as far as overall accuracy goes, there are a couple of neat differences that are going to make the Ursa stand out, particularly at longer range, and they're not notated correctly on the actual comparison charts in-game, at least according to the spreadsheet, and their feel in-game. The first is that the Ursa has slightly less vertical recoil, like very slight. So you're talking a 0.4 vertical for the Ursa versus the Flare's 0.5 vertical. But that difference is actually compounded for the Flare because the first shot recoil multiplier, which is 1.5 times for the Ursa, is actually 2 times for the Flare. So immediately, as soon as you pull the trigger, you're going to feel noticeably more kick from the Flare than you would from the Ursa. And this starts getting more important around 30 meters or so. Both the Flare and the Ursa, as far as the recoil pattern is concerned, they kick up and they have some horizontal, side-to-side shake. So you can really only compensate for the upwards motion because you can't tell which side the weapon is going to pull to. And the Ursa has slightly less side-to-side shake than the Flare, which you'll probably only notice if you're not bursting the weapon over range, which you're probably going to be doing anyway. Another less noticeable factor that sets the Ursa apart from a range perspective is that it has a slightly higher bullet velocity. The Flare runs at 600 meters per second, whereas the Ursa runs at 640 meters per second. Both the Ursa and the Flare have relatively slow rates of fire. The Ursa fires at 550 rounds per minute, and the Flare fires at 577 rounds per minute. That makes the Ursa the slowest firing LMG in the VS arsenal. Still, the difference in rate of fire and time to kill is not very big. You may notice it when fighting in extremely close quarters, where you're otherwise out of your element to begin with, but low rates of fire generally help players compensate for recoil over extreme ranges, and also conserve ammunition. And that could very well be a personal preference thing, but it seems to be the case, at least for me. What I find interesting about the Ursa is that it cannot switch firing modes. So the Ursa isn't going to fire single shots or 3-round burst. And I don't think I've come across any other weapon in the game that does this, so it may in fact be a bug, but please let me know in the comments below if you have found other weapons that act like this. Why it's funny is that bursting or even single-shotting high-damage weapons is how a lot of people seem to prefer fighting over range, especially in support roles. Even though I don't use either the burst or the semi-auto all that often, I do hope that this is just a bug that will be corrected given the long-range nature of the weapon. The Ursa also reloads considerably faster than the Flare, both short and long, which is probably the most important feature to it. The Flare sits at 4.24 short and 5.225 long, whereas the Ursa reloads at 3.6 seconds short and 4.5 seconds long. This is actually a pretty big difference in survivability, as minor as it may look from the outset, and it's why I tend to choose extended magazine for the flare and a forward grip for the Ursa. As far as attachments go, you cannot equip soft point ammo on the Ursa, but you can with the flare. Aside from that, they share each other's attachments, including high velocity ammo, compensator, suppressor, flash suppressor, scopes up to 6x, forward grip, laser sight, extended magazines, and a flashlight. Soft point is important in my eyes because it gives the flare a bit more oomph in close quarter situations with practically no downsides. Soft point does not drop bullet velocity a considerable amount, which means that it's essentially a free boost in damage, unlike high velocity ammo, which is going to make you suffer a jump in cone of fire and bloom. Soft point is good because it helps the flare transition from outdoor environments to indoor environments very well, and that's backed up by its increased rate of fire. So those are the stats in a nutshell. I'd say that the flare is only slightly less useful over range than the Ursa, but both weapons remain useful in support roles. The flare is going to remain reasonably accurate and useful up to around 70 meters, whereas the Ursa can probably extend it out to maybe 100 meters. And both of those distances I'm pointing to without high velocity ammo attached, because the vertical recoil is noticeably increased at longer distances, and that means that you're going to land less bullets on target, or at the very least you're going to have to be firing in smaller bursts, which translates to longer times to kill. So contradictory to high velocity ammo's intended use, I don't think it's going to provide much of a benefit at extremely long ranges, as the bullet velocity is pretty much negligible, but it will help you squeeze out more damage in medium ranges, around 40 meters or so. I'm not going to give out general strategy for this one because the main two things I could mention are just to pick out the right distance to fight at and use cover to help deal with the longer time to kill. But I would like to point out which might be better given your particular playstyle, with some slight references to skill. So if you primarily fight from long range with some transitions to medium range, so if you're fighting in open fields and you're sitting behind a rock and that's where you fight from, if you also fend off the people that come near that rock, then the Ursa is probably the best choice for all around, that style and that situation. But if you're fighting from medium long range and you also transition to medium close range environments, say you're in an open field to begin with, but then you also run inside to help capture points, then I'd suggest the flare. And the differences are that the Ursa is more accurate over range, whereas the flare is less accurate over range, but it has the ability to transition well thanks to not only the soft point ammo and the increased rate of fire, but also the first shot recoil multiplier. And I say that as a good thing because if you're using the flare in close to medium close range, when you're shooting at an enemy's chest, that second round is usually going to end up in the head area. Then after that you start recoil compensating downwards, and this perceived weakness is actually an important advantage when you learn to make use of it. The Ursa would not be able to do that because the recoil is lower all around, and also that it has a lower first shot recoil multiplier. So instead of letting the weapon kick up with that second shot, you actually have to force yourself to aim at the head manually, which is good for players who have high aim, but it's just as controllable as the flare in those close quarters engagements anyway, so that there's a small difference there. As far as attachments go, this also depends greatly on your playstyle. Horizontal recoil is practically impossible to compensate for outside of bursting, meaning that if you want to be very effective over range, you want a forward grip. And I feel like the compensator is optional depending on how well you can compensate for vertical recoil by hand. So if you are fighting from very long range, I'd suggest taking the forward grip. But for everywhere else, so medium range and lower, I'd suggest going with extended magazines. Extended magazines bump the flare and the Ursa up to 150 rounds per magazine, which is the most of any VS LMG, and coupled with the low rate of fire and decent accuracy, that makes them outstanding tools for suppression. And I feel like extended magazines are perhaps more optional, at least a little bit more optional for the Ursa, due to the lower reload time, but it will always be useful. I do not suggest high velocity ammo unless you are also using a compensator to help counteract the increase in recoil, at least for long range fighting. But if you're fighting in medium range, then a compensator is not necessary, and high velocity ammo is actually pretty useful. Soft point ammo is also a great addition to the flare if you plan on using it as a transitional weapon or fighting in close quarters at all, like you see in the video. So hopefully all that makes sense. The slight differences are all pretty important, they all add up, and I think I'm actually going to start using the Ursa more because it's just so pretty looking, and even though the flare is better for my particular playstyle. I'm going to link the what is skill video and also the recoil compensation video at the end of this because I am using the flare a lot in both of them, but also because the first shot recoil multiplier for the flare is really hard to deal with if you do not understand how to compensate for recoil correctly. So hopefully someone will find those useful. But if this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about the channel. And if you'd like to point out something that I missed or tell us which weapon you prefer, please feel free to do so in the comments below, or just post a video response because those are always fun to watch. Thanks very much, folks. We're all signing off.